Okay, welcome everyone. Buonasera. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Fabiola Tosi. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs at the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago. Tonight we are hosting the last lecture of this series presented by Professor Giovanni Aloi, welcome, which is part of this year's program Le Voci della Natura, Ecologies and Nature in Italian Arts, the leading theme of our programs in 2022. In this series, we reflect on how nature has been represented in Italian arts and how creatives have gained awareness of nature preservation and climate change. For this lecture, Professor Aloi will present various examples of contemporary Italian architecture developed with a specific attention to ecology and sustainability. As usual, after the lecture, we will have time for some questions. So feel free to write them anytime in the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of your screen. Many of you have been with us for 5 times now, but still I would like to introduce Professor Giovanni Aloi, who is an author, educator, and curator, specializing in the representation of nature in art. He has published with Columbia University Press, Phaidon, MIT, Laurence King, and Prestel. He has contributed to BBC radio programs, worked at Whitechapel Art Gallery and Tate Galleries in London. He's a USA correspondent for Esse Magazine and a regular public speaker at the Art Institute of Chicago. Aloi has curated exhibitions in the US and Europe. He currently teaches modern and contemporary art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York and London. So leave the mic to Professor Aloi and we'll be back for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabiola. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for attending. I'm just going to share my presentation. And as Fabiola has mentioned tonight, we are concluding the series on Italian art and ecology with a presentation on architecture and sustainability. This is a really important subject for me because sometimes, I'm sure many of you have pondered this idea. It is easy to think about art, the kind of art that we encounter in the gallery space, in museums, as well as outside, as having a limited impact in what it can accomplish. Contemporary art can make us think differently about our relationship with nature, our relationship with non-human beings, but sometimes its impact might seem limited if compared to other areas of human existence that could change more radically, perhaps, the way we live. And of course, what happens in contemporary art, let's say it's a laboratory, it's a workshop in which ideas then percolate in other creative areas. And so, of course, other creative areas cross-pollinate with contemporary art. So every creative sector, in a sense, contributes to a new conception of what it means to be ecologically sustainable today. But when it comes to architecture, of course, complications arise because of the idea of functionality. Functionality doesn't play such a substantial role in contemporary art. Artists can experiment and map territories more freely in speculative ways without having to necessarily feel constrained by economic factors of a certain scale, as well as material durability. Architecture is in itself more than just building spaces to inhabit. Just looking at the importance of architecture in the Renaissance, how architecture becomes central to painting, for instance, tells us a lot about the connection between architecture and humanism. You will remember that I have mentioned in previous talks how the Renaissance is a key moment in the departure between, in the split between culture and nature. And the notion that ultimately what happens inside the architectural structure belongs to culture and what is outside belongs to nature is very interestingly encapsulated by Renaissance painting. Landscape painting, in a sense, doesn't exist in the Renaissance. There's an emphasis on the human body that, as we saw, is intrinsic to humanism and to the study of the experience of being human on this planet. And it is at this point in the representation of many artists that we do perceive this separation and segregation of the natural, the inside-outside dichotomy that had already percolated anyway in previous expressions, artistic expressions. Like, for instance, one of the most imaginative and magical buildings in the history of Italian architecture, the Mausoleo di Galla Placidia, that was built in 425 AD, shows us that building something is never just a matter of creating an enclosure. In this case, a mausoleum, of course, is a building in which the transcendental plays an important role. In a sense, it is a grave, it is a place for remembering, it is a place for a connection with the afterlife. In the Mausoleo di Galla Placidia, the outside of the building carries the materiality and the weight, the sense of materiality and weight of the body. It's expressed through the bare simplicity of the bricks. But once we walk inside, the interior of the structure is covered in mosaics, lapis lazuli. The color of spirituality is everything connected to gold, the color of the divine. So the spiritual is inside, outside the building represents the body. The body is the connection with the natural world that we find outside surrounding the building. This idea of the inside and outside in Italian culture is also presented over and over in frescoes that capture the essence of the birth of the modern city in Italy, which is in itself segregated from the natural world. As we can see here, cities are enclosed by very tall walls that are designed to keep the inhabitants and the possessions safe, and the permeability of the city towards the environment, towards nature, is limited, it's guarded, and it's only allowed at certain times. This separation becomes radical in the minds of those who also elaborate the cultural fabric of the country. Representations of this separation through the doors of cities and towns in the history of Italy, as well as the Middle East and other countries around Europe, is emblematic of this separation, and also is emblematic of the power of architecture, not just to define our everyday lives in terms of functionality, but also to frame our minds and to produce the very matrix through which we think about our position in the world. So as I said, the nature-culture divide, it's the essential conundrum that we are trying to reconsider today. It's a process of deconstruction. We're trying to understand how this dichotomy came to be so dominant in our minds in the West, and what can we do to undo it before it gets too late. And I don't want to be depressing, and I don't want to be negative about this, but I feel that we are late. I would be lying if I said fix what we have damaged so badly by relying on ecological architecture. I think ecological architecture can point towards a direction for a better future. Will we be able to build that future in a reasonable time? That is the big question. And we're going to explore some of these issues today. We're going to think about what is positive and what is problematic about ecological architecture. Now, this idea of the tipping point in the relationship between nature and culture was, of course, more prominent during the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. We witnessed then migrations from the countryside into cities that were exceedingly unhealthy, more and more polluted. And we carry with us today, our cities of today, wherever you are, pretty much in the Western world, carry this legacy. A legacy that I have to acknowledge has over time, starting at least from the second post-war period, been undone in one way or another. As you will remember through my lectures on arte povera, it's during the 1960s that in Italy and other parts of the world, of course, the awareness that something must be done to lay the foundation of a better relationship with the natural world and a better urbanistic design as well begin to take hold in the minds of minorities that then today are growing and growing. You will remember that we explored this unease of the urban environment that sprawled during the 1960s and 70s through the work of Luigi Ghirri, this negotiation between the presence of nature, a nature that looks compressed, trapped, and marginalized, caught up in this jungle of concrete that was the Italian suburbia. It's also important to remember that the damage that was done in Italy, especially after the Second World War, by indiscriminate building linked to the economic boom, is also part of the reason why ecological architecture needs to come into place in the fabric of our cities. Because the way in which in many parts of Europe, the devastation of the Second World War was remedied was basically the beginning of a difficult and different problem altogether. So, sustainability, what does it mean? Well, there are many parameters by which we can measure sustainability, and it might not be a surprise that in Italy itself, sustainability is connected to financial affluence. So it is cities in the north of Italy that tend to score more favorably in the context of sustainability. And when we think about sustainability, we think about the quality of the air, water, mobility, transportation. Public transportation is very important in Italy because of the size of cities. And of course, how much urban green is available. Urban realities in Italy don't fare particularly well when it comes to parks or other green realities. It's part of a heritage that sometimes dates back to the Middle Ages, at other times dates back to the Renaissance. And of course, the recycling of refuse and waste. And it's a complicated picture in the sense that some of the cities that you would expect to fare relatively well, like Rome, for instance. If you visited Rome, you get the impression that there are so many trees there. Actually turns out to be faring relatively well on trees, but not so well in the dust and particles in the atmosphere. So the air is very polluted there. And other cities like Milan, for instance, don't score particularly well on trees, but do better in other capacities, like, for instance, recycling, as well as the possibility to clean up certain form of impossible to avoid waste. So the question of sustainability is a question of attunement. What does it mean? It means that attunement means that you have to get in tune with something else. Because in the notion of attunement lies the understanding that human actions will always be, in a way or another, destructive to a certain degree, that they will interfere with the environment. And in that sense, destructing that doesn't necessarily mean negative in itself. Think about beavers, for instance. Animals can be distractive in nature. Beavers can change the course of rivers when they fall trees to create dams. So in a sense, humans are not alone among animals. I can think as well about African elephants that devastate expanses of trees as they try to feed and leave behind more desert than they originally encountered. However, they replenish the area with their excrements and the seeds that will germinate from them. So there are ways in which our distractive approaches to the environment can be mitigated and integrated in better ways. And this notion of attunement was already explored by architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright, who you will remember during the 20s and 30s looked at architecture from a different perspective. Frank Lloyd Wright looked at architecture as an integral part of the landscape, using local materials for both economic as well as ecologic reasons, and also studying the environment that surrounds the building site in order to attune the architectural form with the mood, with the character of the land. So we find in Frank Lloyd Wright many of the initial concepts that have become now central to environmental architecture. And some of you might also be familiar with the work of Sullivan, Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham, trademark architects for the city of Chicago, also developed the concept of organic architecture. The concept of organic architecture is based on the studying of nature and the principle that form always follows function. So this principle that then becomes central to the history of architecture itself is also nestled in the question of ecological architecture and how we can acknowledge the natural world before we begin to even think about the type of building that can be situated in a specific location. Now, I have structured this talk beginning from an urban intervention that caused a lot of uproar and upset in Italy, and I'm ending it with another urban intervention that does the opposite, and both are related to gardens. I think gardens are important places in the culture of humanity, the discourse between humanity and nature, but they're also more intimate spaces in which we can more carefully appreciate the complexities involved in our relationship with nature and architecture. You're probably wondering, why is Giovanni showing us a very poor quality image of something we can't even tell what it is? Well, you're right, but this is all that is available for this specific event. It's a CCTV camera footage still from events that unfolded in Milan in 2017 on February 18th. You will see this bright area here. That's a fire, and it's a tree burning, a palm tree. This is Piazza del Duomo, which is one of the most visible and important places in the city. I'm going to show you some pictures of the beautiful cathedral that dates back to the 13th century. It's one of the jewels of Italian architecture. You're probably wondering, why is this palm tree ablaze in the middle of the night? Well, it's been set alight by Azione Identitaria, a right-wing movement who objected to the new landscaping in Piazza del Duomo. And I have to tell you, I was surprised too when I heard the news. I was having a Zoom call with my parents, and they told me that these trees were being installed in Piazza del Duomo as part of a new design for the square. And my instant response was to wonder, why bananas and palm trees? And that response made me wonder. It led me onto a journey of asking myself why I would find something discordant in the association between the architecture of the Duomo, which is a Romanic Gothic architecture, and the palm trees and banana trees. I'm always happy to have more trees anywhere, and I've never been picky when it comes to species. So that's where my curiosity came from. Why am I reacting with surprise? And so that you know, those of you who have not been in Milan, the local trees are not necessarily native trees, but have trees that have established themselves over time and that have become favorites in the city are the sycamore, maples, the horse chestnut, which is absolutely glorious pretty much everywhere around Milan, poplars, ginkgos, which are by no means exclusive to Italy or Milan, of course, one of the oldest trees on this planet, and magnolias. As you can see, there's actually a magnolia blooming just on the north side of the cathedral. So this apparent contradiction between the palm trees, banana trees, and the architecture of the Duomo is probably driven by the fact that palm trees and banana trees are not usually seen around the city. As you can see here, Milan is a city that doesn't have much vegetation, very built up, very closed in, like many other Italian cities, and very different from other cities like Rome or Palermo, or Naples, in which palm trees are very much the norm. Also, it gets pretty cold in Milan in winter. It can snow, sometimes it doesn't, but let's say that I have seen palm trees doing quite well. Maybe we should say surviving in some courtyards in Milan. And they look like a bit of a unicorn when you spot them, because you feel like, wow, this is like a very brave plant that's managed to pull through these harsh winters somehow. But technically, you know, that's not really their climate. So how did these palm trees and banana trees arrive in Piazza del Duomo? And why is there a sense of contradiction? Well, the contradiction in itself is generated by this incongruity that's linked to national identity, as well as a cultural identity that it's made of architectural features as well as plants. Plants are not just pretty green things. And this incident in which palm trees and banana trees were set alight shows that very clearly. So national identity, very important. The Duomo in Milan is a very important building. It is seen by the Milanese as the jewel of the city. It's very well respected across Europe and the world as a fabulous example of Gothic architecture. And the association, the cultural association between the Gothic and its northern heritage is not palm trees and bananas, because what we associate with the Gothic is perhaps more like pine trees and other deciduous species that are more commonly found in northern France or in Germany. So this is where the clash comes from. It doesn't matter that the trees can live in this specific area. We might still find the aesthetic association of the architectural design and the tree species somewhat strident. And of course, there's more. I began to dig deeper into this strident idea, and also in the notion that this strident effect should be triggering such strong reaction as to setting the palm trees alight. And of course, this research has led me to a complex past of Italy, a past of immigration and a past of resistance to immigration that is also very much part of our present. So for those of you who have kept an ear to the ground with the immigration tensions that have traversed Italy over the past 20 years, you might be aware of the intolerance that has developed in the north, especially for the waves of immigration of refugees from Northern Africa. And it is in this context that we should remember that Italy is a relatively new country, as a unified country, and that the identitarian component that defines Italy is very weak in a sense, especially at times. For many decades now, if I remember correctly, probably since the end of the 1980s, political parties like the Lega Nord has advocated for a split of Italy, north and south. And more recently, they have taken on the immigration issue from Northern Africa, using it again as an opportunity to fragment Italy further. In this poster that they've been using, a propaganda poster, you read that Native Americans have put up with immigration, and today they live in reserves. The red word here, pensaci, means think about it. So following the protest, the initial protest of rejection of the palm trees being planted in Piazza del Duomo, there were more protests pointing out clearly at the Africanization of Piazza del Duomo. So the idea became more and more prominent, the notion that there is this fear that national identity is being attacked, and that therefore bananas and palm trees are not just plants that beautify the piazza, but that they're actually emblems of Africa that are coming to colonize Italy. And again, other images, derogatory and insulting association of a racial kind, in which you see right-wing protesters eating bananas, forgetting, of course, that Italy is a country of immigrants. The waves of immigration from the 19th century, as well, of course, as the one from the early 20th century. Luckily, also those in favor of the presence of banana trees and palm trees came to Piazza del Duomo with a diversity celebration in which they brought all sorts of vegetables and plants. You can see them here. There's pineapples, there's inflatable palm trees, and there's all sorts of representations of tomatoes and potatoes and oranges being held, as well as potted plants. But I haven't told you yet, how did these palm trees and bananas arrive in Piazza del Duomo? They arrived there thanks to Starbucks, of all things. Again, we got a nice colonialist route into this story. It was a gift to the city designed by Marco Bai, a very well-known landscape designer and architect. And it was designed to be a garden for the city, celebrating the opening of the first Starbucks in the country. Well, what a gift that was. And the big surprise was that if you read carefully into the thought process that went into the making of this gift to the city by Marco Bai, is an original study, according to which, and this photograph demonstrates it, there were palm trees growing in Piazza del Duomo during the second half of the 19th century. These were eventually removed. So what Marco Bai is trying to accomplish is actually a pretty conservative gesture. He's trying to bring back the original vegetation of Piazza del Duomo, building a historical bridge between a Milan that was and the Milan of today. But of course, that thread is being missed. And one of the largest producers of bananas in the world, Chiquita, also took the opportunity to advertise bananas and turn the controversy into a marketing opportunity. So the story is, of course, complex and sad. It is said that trees should be set alight. It is said that trees and the species of membership should be seen as a symbolic emblem of colonization. But we know today that even on this side of the world, things are complicated when it comes to plant species, where they are situated in the urban environment, and their relationship to architecture. Here in the United States, there's a lot of talk about native species, and those that have been imported by colonialism. And there's, of course, a lot of sensitivity with plants like cotton and other plants that were responsible for changing not just the ecology of this land, but also reconfiguring completely the social structure and identity of this country. So it is with this preamble, with this discordant mapping, that I wanted to begin a quick journey through some of the most interesting example of architettura ecologica in Italy, so that we can get a sense of what ecological architecture can do, and where perhaps we might need to work a little harder too. So there are some important points that we need to consider when it comes to ecological architecture. First of all, archaeological architecture must take into consideration energetic consumption, not just at the point of living in the space, but also at the point of constructing it. So from the very beginning. It's therefore not a surprise that ecological architecture tends to employ a minimalist approach, because it's about what Mies van der Rohe used to say, less is more. The notion that ultimately, if we reduce, then sustainability might come into place more easily. The emphasis on local materials that I said earlier was already pioneered by Frank Lloyd Wright. Using local materials means to engage in a dialogue with the building and the environment, but also to limit transportation and to limit other costs related to sourcing. And of course, recyclable materials. We all know that buildings, for as wonderful as they are, don't last as much as those that were made in the past. We just saw beautiful images of the Duomo in Milan that dates back to the 13th century, but our buildings usually go through different kinds of transformations for different reasons, so the recyclability of the material is extremely important. And I wanted to begin with the first example for tonight. The first example I wanted to mention to you is a nursery in Guastalla, of which you can see here. Guastalla is a town close to Reggio Emilia, just about 30 kilometers from it. And I wanted to show you this time-lapse video in which you can see how it was built, as I give you a sense of how wonderful this building is. First of all, it's a nursery designed for children age 0 to 3. And it's designed by the architectural firm Mario Cucinella Studio. And some of you might remember that in 2012, the area of Guastalla was devastated by an earthquake. So the two nurseries that were pre-existing in the area were demolished because they were too damaged. And this nursery is now designed to replace both. It's made of recycled glass and wood. I personally find it extremely beautiful, not just because it's elegant, and I love the biomorphic shape. You can see all these beautiful curved lines that echo natural forms instead of the rectilinear forms of traditional classical architecture. But there's something more. When we think about children, I'm going to talk about children. I never thought I was going to do this as part of my career, but here we are. Children are not my subject. But what's fascinating is the idea that the world we have designed for children tends to be pretty artificial. There's a sense of intense coloration. You know, when there's a playground, there's all those clashing colors that I personally find revolting. I don't understand why we come from a place of assuming that children need to be hyper-stimulated with all these colors, and that their world should be so much more colorful than ours, so that when they grow up, of course, they're going to become depressed because they're going to be surrounded by a gray world that doesn't quite match their experience as children. What I love about the nursery in Guastalla is that it uses organic colors, and there's none of that bright clashing that's designed to distract the children. The point of this nursery is to actually let them engage with the environment around them and focus on materials that are organic. So the conversation between the space outside and the building is extremely important. That's why so much of the building is made of glass, transparency. There's something important about training the children to understand, even if, yeah, I'm not quite sure where you can get a child aged 0 to 3 to understand about sustainability. But apparently there are activities that take place in this nursery that engage the children with the ability the building has to be self-sufficient. And these ideas are woven into activities that also spill onto the garden. You've probably seen the cultivated area around it. There are herbs and there are plants that are used for the day-to-day running of this beautiful nursery. And one of the most poetic and fascinating things about it, I've never been so excited about children in my whole life, is the original idea. It's the belly of the whale in Pinocchio. Isn't that great? You can really see how different forms of art, from storytelling, literature, to architecture and design come together beautifully and expand into the natural world. You're probably wondering, how much did this cost? Well, it cost about 2.3 million of euros. So it's not cheap, but it kind of like factors in a low maintenance cost on a day-to-day running for the building, which then ends up mitigating the original investment made in this for this building. You can see here in this graph how the positioning of the trees is strategic in order to shade the building at certain times of the day, especially. You can see how water is collected on the roof and then becomes part of the needs of the building, and also how air is regulated without the use of air conditioning. This is an emphasis that takes place in many of these eco-friendly buildings. The idea that ultimately reducing the use of air conditioning in summer as well as heating in winter, making the buildings as heat retentive as possible in winter is of great help, because of course it reduces the use of fuel and it reduces the use, the creation of combustion. But there's also, of course, solar panels that help the building create energy for itself. Never wish that would want to return to my childhood, but if I could be there, I would probably give it a shot for a few days. Another example that I'm pretty fond of, because this is in Milan, is the campus of the Bocconi University, one of the most famous universities in Europe. This was recently completed in 2021 by Studio Sana, which is a Japanese firm, and it cost 130 million euros to make. It's characterized by semi-transparent walls that allow visibility and connection to the outside. This is a concept that we have just seen in the nursery. And the buildings that create the campus are connected, as you can see here, by courtyards. Now, the architecture looks extremely futuristic. And once again, I'm sure you can notice this organic forms that are curvilinear. But the architects have spent a lot of time thinking about the surrounding areas in Milan and trying to implement recurring aspects of the architecture of Milan within this modern rendition. And those of you who have been to Milan know that courtyards are very important to the cultural fabric and social fabric of the city. So each of these buildings has courtyards that are inspired by courtyards in Milan. Of course, the use of glass is also motivated by the desire to capitalize on natural lighting, which brings down the costs and pollution caused by electric lighting. You've probably noticed all the solar panels on the roofs. And of course, there's a very important aspect here in the ventilation of the and the shape of the building are enabling a ventilation that it's natural to a certain degree in order again to cut down the expenses and pollution connected to air conditioning. The very interesting element that we see in some of these images, not necessarily this one but this one is the use of these panels. These panels are central to the making of this project, and they are made entirely of recycled polypropylene. They allow the building to be light enough so that the foundation don't need to be quite as deep for a building this tall. And again, that cuts costs as well as pollution when the foundations are laid. And the panels also help the building regulate itself in terms of heat because of their ability to filtrate the sunlight. The inside walls are also 50% see-through and 50% opaque, which again allows a certain level of natural lighting to create different atmospheres and different lighting moods within the buildings. And this has been one of the biggest successes in the Italian history of ecological architecture. Very recent. I certainly recommend visiting it if you happen to be in Milan in the near future. And there's a system of classification called LEED, which is an institutional classification of compliance with ecological requirements. And this building has been classified as platinum, which is the highest level of classification for the standard. And I know that I have now showed you two public buildings, or let's say buildings in which different social interactions take place. What about private buildings? Well, the road is longer in that sense because, of course, the financial cost, the impact cost-wise is much more sustained. This is the first private property, private home to have been certified platinum by LEED. So it's at the same standard as the Bocconi campus I just showed you. And it belongs to the CEO of a very important brand in Italy, Diadora. The house is almost entirely self-sustained. And what's particularly fascinating about Bio Casa 82 is that in itself is made of almost entirely recycled materials. So there are 99% of recyclable materials and 100% of the rainwater collected from the building that feeds back into the house itself. And there's also, the house is 100% energy production, self-sustained. So it's almost like a self-enclosed little jewel. Of course, for this to work, every part of the house has been custom made, and it has been created with specific requirements. It's not quite as easy as going to specific outlets and buy a kitchen. There has to be certain requirements for this to work in itself in harmony. The house itself around is surrounded by a meadow, not a garden. And that's also important because a garden, of course, entails an interaction that it's different from letting the vegetation take care of itself. And another really successful example is Muse, which is a science museum that opened in Trento in 2013. This is located in the new district of the Le Albere, where the former factory Michelin was closed recently. It's been designed by architect Renzo Piano. Those of you who are in Chicago know this name already because he's designed the modern wing at the Art Institute of Chicago. And this has been certified gold by LEED. And it's the first Italian museum to be certified as such. The sustainability here too is extremely high, and you can see the space again, capitalizing on a lot of glass, capitalizing on natural lighting, and the integration between the outside, the landscape, the connection between the nature outside and the nature inside the building. Again, we have our solar panels, as well as different ways to catch water and to render the building as self-sustainable as possible. You can see also how the shape of the building itself is inspired by the surrounding landscape. And of course, the quintessential example of ecological architecture, very controversial, but nonetheless particularly scenic, is the Bosco Verticale by Stefano Boeri. Again, if you've not been to Milan, this is a great site. I've enjoyed seeing it being built. And today it looks stunning that all these beautiful plants are growing onto it. I'm just going to play you a little clip so you can get a sense of how wonderful the structure is. So there it is in its glory. It's pretty much a vertical forest, right? That's what the name entails. 20,000 square meters of forest, in fact. Terraces will here occupy 800, will house 800 trees, 480 large and medium, 300 small, and also 15,000 plants and 5,000 shrubs. The Bosco Verticale is capable of absorbing 14 tons of carbon dioxide and will produce 9 tons of oxygen every year, which is, of course, an asset for any kind of building. The tower alone generates 65% of its energy and has hundreds of solar panels on the ceilings, as you can see on the top, as you can see there. Now, there are 2 residential towers. One is 120 and the second one is 76 meter tall. And they are particularly fascinating from the outside because you notice this beautiful effect of the Bosco Verticale, but at the same time, there are some complications. As you can imagine, when you bring vegetation so close to your doors and windows, there will be animals coming in. So there are sometimes issues with ants, wasps, bees, all sorts of pests that come into the house, and that's, I guess, just part of the parcel. But there are also a number of birds that have been nesting in these trees. There's over 20 species of birds. So it's not just a matter of dressing up the building with some greenery. It's a matter of creating an ecosystem all around it, an ecosystem that can sustain itself as much as possible. And of course, the downside of a building that is so iconic is that it attracts celebrities. It's not affordable for the normal, the common Milanese, and it is, in the sense, it has become a bone of contention. And it has become also representative of this very issue that eco-architecture can end up being a privilege for the hyper wealthy. But there's something, I think, important here in this negotiation between doing something like this and at the same time not doing it. I think the message it sends as a poster boy for the eco-architectural movement is certainly important, and it shows that something like this could be done, perhaps on a smaller scale or a more affordable scale later on. These are pioneering experiments, in a sense. What I find personally not particularly conducive about this approach is that the residents are not really allowed to interact with the vegetation in these buildings. So there is, of course, a team of gardeners who maintain the building and the vegetation. And as a building, as an apartment owner, you're not really allowed to personalize your balcony as much as you would if you own a balcony or a garden elsewhere, because the planting is being selected very, very carefully based on the lighting conditions, the north-south orientation of building, and of course the heat and coolness that these plants can withstand, not just as species in general, but also in relation to the altitude. So let's say that it becomes like a complex jewel that needs to be taken care of by a team of experts. And it's perhaps not quite reconnecting us with nature as much as we need to as well. I claim that we need to take seriously not just the embellishment, the eco-critical question of dressing up our building with green, but to really work harder and deeper at reconnecting ourselves, re-educating ourselves with nature through genuine contact, through genuine proximity. So the images that I'm showing you here, this video, shows us a really interesting complex, a building called the Manifattura Tabacchi in Florence that was operational until recently in 2001, operated for almost 70 years, and was then left disused for roughly 20. Of course, what happened was that plants took over the building. Plants play an essential role into ecological architecture, into the finding a new balance between us and nature and the built environment. You can see here the plants recolonizing the environment. And today, the Manifattura Tabacchi is an arts center, very vibrant and very active. And it is in the context of this arts center that the architect and landscape designer Antonio Perazzi has held a workshop called Botanica Temporanea, l'arte dei giardini invisibili, in which he works with renegotiating space with plants. So the exhibition, if we want to call it so, was very much based on the idea of workshop and participation. So I really like as well the idea that ecological architecture can break down the concepts that we have carried with us for far too long, that an exhibition is something that we look at from a distance and that it's not engaging our contribution. And in this case, the Botanica Temporanea involved the participation of people, locals, who situated plants along certain walkways in the art center that were used daily by visitors, and therefore learning and knowing about the plants that were being positioned in these paths helped engaging with the species that are well known in the area, species that are sometimes perceived as well as weeds, and the negotiation of space. And let's say to co-author as a community a new balance with vegetation and nature. There's something of it that it's workshop based in terms of collaboration. There's something of this exhibition that it's important in the sense of coming together to learn about plants, and something that is just important in terms of focusing on plants, because as you know, we have been almost become blind to plants, considering them as vegetation and ornamentation rather than the quintessential elements and key agents in the ecosystems that we share with them. In the concept of this exhibition, 1,555 plants were used, counting more than 50 species. And it's in the context of this work and also another project by Antonio Perazzi that I would like to bring this series to an end. As I promised you, we started with a not very happy garden, and we are the garden in Piazza del Duomo that caused a lot of controversy. We're ending with happier gardens that in which nothing is set alight, but in which communities come together to learn about plants and rethink the balance between the urban and natural environment. The images you're seeing here are from Home Ground, a garden project that Perazzi worked on in 2019 in Giarre, in Sicilia, in Sicily. And the project, which is called Home Ground, was part of the Giardini Produttivi Festival, the idea of creating something of a garden that it's beautiful, aesthetically integrated with the urban reality, but also productive. What is at stake with productivity? With productivity, there is at stake the question of sustainability and social justice, the idea of food accessibility, the idea of creating urban environments in which people can come together. So rediscovering, in a sense, or reconstructing the notion of the Greek agora, in which people come together to create democracy, to create society. You can see here in Perazzi's garden that there is a formal grid, which is not perhaps what we might expect in the context of ecological architecture. But this is how I think Perazzi is trying to negotiate the cultural aspect of culture and the natural aspect of nature. The idea that ultimately the cultural aspect, which is visible here in the grid, is not something that we need to purge, but it's something that we need to integrate. Now, the trees that Perazzi is choosing for this garden are a combination of native trees from Sicily and a range of trees, fruit trees from Africa. This is not just because of the proximity between Africa and Sicily and the south of Italy, which, as we have seen earlier in Milan, created a lot of friction in the context of racial tension, but it's also linked to climate change. You know, with global warming, some plants that would have not thrived in Sicily from Africa will now and have started to find themselves more at home. So the question that Antonio Perazzi poses with this project, with Home Ground, is to think more carefully about notions of national identity, the integration between architecture and plants. What does sustainability mean for the future, not just for today? And what kind of gardens we should be planting so that a better future, a more sustainable future, can effectively unfold. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. Lots of interesting examples. I think I want to start some, more thinking and some questions from the ones that you define more controversial. And I kind of wanted to introduce the idea of greenwashing in architecture as well. I think the first example that you showed in Milan, I remember it very well, actually. The idea that project was, a donation from a big company like Starbucks, that, however, was, I don't think it was clear to everyone that was where the project came from. Like, I'm thinking about, the average, person living in Milan did not know about that connection. But still, I think like a lot of companies are trying to do this type of, financing projects that appear to be bringing green spaces to cities, while also continuing to do work that sometimes can be controversial in terms of, in relation to ecology and sustainability as well.
Absolutely.
So that feels like pretty much an evident example of it. But then I'm thinking about the Bosco Verticale as well, which is a little more in between, right? The Bosco Verticale feels to me like all the things you said, like having seen it evolving, having seen the project, not just in Milan, but like evolving in other cities as well. I often question personally, what was the role of that type of architecture? Was it really bringing something that we can call bringing back nature to a urban environment? And I think the most pertinent definition that I heard about the Bosco Verticale is that it creates a landscape, it doesn't create an ecology. which I think is very important to think about when we think about this type of architecture. Does it really create a new environment inside the city, or is it just a landscape? And so it doesn't have that role of like creating not just something green, but also something that animals can live in, and like considers the right type, the type of, you know, green and plants that should be in that environment. And so the question related to Bosco Verticale is it just a genuine, and I'll add failed though, attempt to you know, create ecological architecture, or do you think it is sort of like a product of that capitalism and greenwashing, and it's pretty much a sort of like conscious use of the interest that people have in ecology, but without really contributing to the, you know, to the discourse in practicality?
I think it's a difficult question to address, in the sense that I agree with you that much of it looks like greenwashing, in the sense that I think the big drawback is that it has attracted so many celebrities, and that the costs of living in that building are prohibitive. So basically it's a luxury building. And I think that that is emblematic of a serious risk that we're running with ecological architecture. I am somewhat more pleased by the notion that there is a biodiversity of the plants that have been selected, as well as the animals that tend to populate the building. That seems to be real. But of course, you see, it's very hard to find out exactly what happens, because a building of that kind with all that vegetation around it will also require treatment with herbicides as well as insecticides. There is no way, you know, it's almost like a dream that we just put a few trees on a building and they'll take care of themselves, and everything will be harmonious and thrive. The maintenance for these type of buildings are enormous, and I wonder about also the meaning of that maintenance. There is a point in which I think our lives, the speed of our lives, the expectations of what we should accomplish in a day have been completely out of kilter. I think we became very aware of that at the beginning of the pandemic, where suddenly we had a couple of moments to breathe in and realize how hyper our lives was. But to the question, for instance, that I see in the chat of, let's talk about the maintenance, part of me acknowledges it. Of course, there's maintenance, but I don't subscribe to the idea that we should find that a burden. I think that maintenance is only a burden because of the capitalist system and the speed of our lives that have generated these kind of impossible models in which we feel like we always have to do something else. How about we spend less time on social media? How about we all have 2 hours a day built into our work lives that we can spend tending to the green, right? The maintenance only becomes a problem because we have to be at work 9 to 5 and then like deal with all the other demands of contemporary life, which, as we know, is not healthy for us. So at the bottom of that question of maintenance also lies a broader question about the sustainability of our lives and what capitalism has done to them, to the point that we perceive tending to green as a burden rather than as a regenerative activity that would actually make us happier. The problem with Bosco Verticale, we fold back to your question there, Fabiola, is that the people who live in the building have got nothing to do with the green. So to me, that is a major flaw of that. And if we were to label it greenwashing, I think, unfortunately, to me, that's where the whole thing falls apart. If I live in a building in which I cannot take care of the grounds and develop a relationship with the plants, then it is a facade. Then it is the equivalent of some kind of accessory that decorates, and it's not. But on the other end, I like to imagine, I've not lived in the Bosco Verticale, so I don't want to draw too many conclusions, but I like to imagine that some people who live in the building enjoy the presence of the animals that come and nest the birds that come and nest onto their balconies and the trees and can observe some nature. So maybe there is some leeway, but there is a big question mark hovering right above the icon in that case.
Yeah, it's true. And I think for me is the idea that, you know, the species that are starting to populate Bosco Verticale were not planned for, at least that's the feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was planned to be this green, you know, magnificent architecture,
Yeah.
but it wasn't planned, again, as an ecosystem. And so the idea that the green is okay, but the animals are then become a problem is contradictory with the idea itself of ecological architecture, because there's no ecology if there isn't both plants and animals.
Which
and
also
humans.
brings another question there about our tolerance for pests. And again, it's a challenge because I don't think anyone wants ants in their home. Nobody wants a wasp nest in their home. But that's the also practicality of bringing nature closer, is that kind of renegotiation also might have to be reconfigured. You know, I have students at the School of the Art Institute who are born and live in Singapore and come to study. And Singapore is incredibly lush, and they all talk about the different relationship between, you know, the invasion, the insect invasion in your home. You know, that it happens. It can be undesirable, but it's tolerated in different ways, because I think in the Western world, and especially in certain parts of the Western world, we have really become used to this completely sealed separation. As you probably know, in the south of Italy, it's much more common because of the abundance of insects or geckos or other creatures that something ends up in the house in summer, you know, when you keep your windows open, and that's a lot less common in Milan. So I wonder, for instance, what would have happened if Bosco Verticale had been built in Naples or Palermo. You know, how would the reaction be there, and how would the intolerance for this permeability of the boundary between us and the non-human would have come across? But I think Milan is a special case in that respect, right? Because I remember growing up there as a child. It was so hard to invite any kind of creature to come into your home. You know, it's like I always felt like, especially in the 80s, it was a bit of a nature desert more than anything else.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, which is part of why a lot of these type of projects like Bosco Verticale and the one at the Duomo took over, like over time, started to take over in the city by almost like not organically or not, or like too quickly without thinking about, you know, the actual full context of the planning process.
Yeah, I think that's a very cunning observation. They are not happening, you know, the palm trees and the banana trees happened overnight, and it was a surprise. And again, do we need banana trees and palm trees in Piazza del Duomo? When we look at, you know, the example of a garden that's actually producing fruit for people to eat. I've actually heard that the banana trees in Milan are fruiting now, but I don't know that they're being harvested. And again, they're not supporting the community in any shape or form, right, in that sense.
I see another question from Kathy. It says, playing devil's advocate. Many people live in high rises that they can interact with, often expensive high rises. Although this doesn't provide a true relationship with the green, it does absorb CO2 and produce oxygen, unlike other buildings. So at least providing a functionality that's absent in many cities.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. We shouldn't forget about that. It is certainly important in the factor, but I think it needs the needle needs to be balanced between the pros and cons. You know, there'll always be negatives and drawbacks. I personally, I wouldn't get fixated on the bees and the wasps that the greenwashing is also a very important concern, I think. It's a kind of like flickering of the two.
Yeah, and I think that's why we talk about greenwashing in terms of the Bosco Verticale, because you know, you said it very well. There are like certain criteria, like the energy consumption, minimalism, local materials, recyclable materials. If we don't meet all those mark points, is it really ecological architecture?
Yeah.
Bosco Verticale certainly does not meet all the you know, all the boundaries that we set. So it's true, it may have some benefit, but those benefits kind of hide the fact that it is another building that contributes to just like urbanization.
Yeah, and in the sense of social justice, I think there is the question of nature becoming a commodity for the very rich, you know. So in a kind of symbolic way, there's an issue there that becomes broader, and that might be symptomatic of a future. You know, I'm sure we're all familiar with those studies that claim that it will be the hyper rich who will always get a better deal as climate change unfolds. And I think in a sense, Bosco Verticale unwittingly became the icon of that proposition that in a world in which we're all bound to lose so much because of climate change, it's only the hyper rich who will be able to surround themselves in the greenery of nature.
Right.
So yeah, it is fascinating as it is problematic, I think.
I don't think we have any other questions. So I just want to thank you, Giovanni, again, and everyone who joined us tonight. It's true, it's the last lecture of this series, but spoiler alert, Giovanni will be back in fall of this year for another series of conversations with artists and curators on similar topics to the ones that we talked through throughout this series. So I want to encourage everyone to continue to check out our website and subscribe to the newsletter so you won't miss when we announce the dates. We also have some interesting programs coming up, especially as we get into summer. So thanks again, everyone who has been joining us tonight or throughout. Thank you, Giovanni, and good night.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Fabiola, for your hosting and the interesting questions. Thank you all for attending, and I shall see you all soon.
Thank you.